The rusted iron armor of humanity's ancient tanks crashed through the crumbling ruins of Arcturus IV, sending cracked alien skeletons flying through the dust-choked air. Captain Nathan Stevens choked on the ash of defeated worlds while slamming his fingers across the comms panel, open-firing with desperate pleading. "This is Captain Stevens of Arcturus Defense Corps. We are taking heavy losses. Request immediate assistance from any Earth forces." Stevens' face was creviced with scars of warfare across the stars. His fleet was in tatters, debris from obliterated ships cutting into Arcturus's stormy skies. The Vulcan commander Thul's cruel smirk played on repeat across the cracked viewscreen, his gravel-lathered voice promising only slaughter. "Surrender now, pitiful humans. Your species will be but dust." Hope was abandoned, until static crackled across the radio waves, a tinny voice fighting against the destruction. "Captain Stevens, this is Commander Johnson of the Earth Historical Battalion. Ancient weapon systems are en route to your position. ETA, 10 minutes. Hold fast. Salvation approaches." The promise of victory injected fire into Stevens' veins, even as plasma torpedoes rained upon his crippled fleet. These tanks were relics of a barbaric past, but desperation turned back the clock. Would the rusted weapons of yesteryear bring ruin upon the alien foe? Or would the last embers of humanity be extinguished in the cold expanse of space? Stevens gritted his teeth, refusing to let the Vulcans taste Earth's blood this day. He would hold the line, even if it cost every last life. The drop pods crashed onto Arcturosphere's jagged landscape, smashing ancient rock formations as the remnants of the human fleet spilled out onto the barren world. Stevens yanked himself out of a dented pod, his body aching from the impact. He surveyed the inhospitable terrain of towering mountains and deep canyons, the planet's thin atmosphere barely filtering the harsh sunlight. "Set up a temporary base in that valley," Stevens shouted, pointing to a defensible position nestled between two steep cliffs. His troops, battered but not broken, hurried to comply, unloading supplies and setting up makeshift fortifications. As the base took shape, a comm officer approached Stevens, his face grim. "Sir, I have an update on the tank convoy. They were ambushed by Vulcan forces near the Kuiper Belt. They're still on their way, but they've been delayed." Stevens cursed under his breath. With limited supplies and ammunition, he knew they couldn't hold out long against the Vulcan ground troops that were already descending on the planet. He had to find a way to even the odds. The scouts set out clambering over the rocky terrain. Sergeant Mike Thompson led one of the teams, his keen eyes scanning the landscape for any advantage. As they approached a particularly steep mountain range, Thompson noticed something unusual. "Hold up," he said, raising a fist. "There's an opening here, looks like a tunnel." The team cautiously approached the entrance, their weapons at the ready. As they stepped inside, they found themselves in a vast network of ancient alien tunnels, the walls smooth and glowing with an eerie bioluminescence. Thompson activated his comlink. "Captain Stevens, you're not going to believe this. We've found a network of tunnels under the mountains. They look old, really old. Might be from some long-extinct civilization." Stevens' mind raced with possibilities. "Can we use them to our advantage?" "Definitely," Thompson replied. "We could use these tunnels to flank the Vulcans, hit them from behind while they're focused on our base." Stevens made his decision. "Do it. I'm ordering the majority of our forces to take shelter in those tunnels. Leave a small group on the surface to draw the Vulcans' attention." As the human troops moved into the tunnels, Stevens could see the dust clouds on the horizon, signaling the approach of the Vulcan ground forces. He gripped his rifle tightly, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a plan. They needed to buy time for the tanks to arrive, but every minute counted. The fate of Earth hung in the balance, and Stevens would be damned if he let the Vulcans win this day. He had a desperate plan, a gambit that could either turn the tide or spell their doom. The Vulcans were closing in, their weapons glinting in the harsh sunlight. Stevens took a deep breath, ready to put his plan into action. It was all or nothing now, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. Stevens yelled out the order as the Vulcan forces began their attack, plasma fire raining down on the humans' makeshift base. The defenders returned fire, the sound of gunfire and explosions filling the air. Bullets pinged off Vulcan armor as the aliens advanced, their weapons spitting deadly bolts of energy. In the tunnels below, Thompson and his team moved quickly, their footsteps echoing off the ancient walls. They emerged behind the Vulcan lines, catching the enemy by surprise. Grenades were tossed into supply depots, sending shockwaves through the ground. The communications array was peppered with bullets, sparks flying as the equipment was destroyed. Tholes slammed his fist on the console, his face contorted with rage as he watched the battle unfold. His troops were being outmaneuvered by the humans, their advance stalled by the unexpected resistance. "Enough of this," Thule growled. "Deploy the neutron bomb. Let's see how these humans fare against our most devastating weapon." The bomb dropped from the Vulcan ship, streaking through the atmosphere like a falling star. Stephen's heart raced as he received the transmission from the tank convoy. "Captain, we're entering the atmosphere now, but we need a clear landing zone. Can you provide support?" Stevens gripped his rifle tightly. "Affirmative. We'll clear a path for you, but we've got a bigger problem. The Vulcans have deployed a neutron bomb. If it detonates, it'll wipe out all life on the surface." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Understood. We'll do what we can to assist. Just get us that landing zone." Stevens turned to his troops, his voice booming over the chaos of battle. "All units converge on the neutron bomb's landing site. We have to destroy it before it detonates. This is our only chance to save ourselves and the tank convoy. Move out." The human forces began to move, racing towards the bomb's trajectory. They knew the odds were against them, but they were determined to fight to the last. The fate of the battle, and perhaps the entire war, hinged on their success. As they approached the landing site, the Vulcan forces intensified their attack, desperate to protect their weapon. Bullets and plasma bolts filled the air as the two sides clashed, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Stevens led the charge, his rifle blazing as he cut down Vulcan after Vulcan. His men followed close behind, their weapons adding to the cacophony of battle. They pushed forward, inch by bloody inch, the bomb growing larger in their sights. The neutron bomb hit the ground with an earth-shaking impact, kicking up a cloud of dust and debris. The human forces charged forward, determined to reach the bomb before it could detonate. Time seemed to slow as they closed the distance, the seconds ticking away like an eternity. Time felt frozen as Stevens and his team charged towards the crashed neutron bomb, the fate of their species hinging on this desperate gambit. Plasma bolts singed the air, the Vulcan elite guard unleashing a hailstorm of fire to protect their doomsday weapon. Thompson and his strike force burst from the ancient tunnels, salvaged Vulcan rifles spitting deadly energy as they provided crucial cover fire. Stevens ducked and weaved through the chaos, his own weapon barking in defiance. The two forces clashed in a brutal melee, the clamor of war drowning out all else. Humans grappled with armored Vulcans, combat knives finding gaps in alien plate. Improvised bombs erupted in starbursts of shrapnel and flame, breaching the enemy line. Victory was within grasp when a piercing whine split the sky. A Vulcan gunship swooped down, raking Stevens' team with searing beams of destruction. Men cried out as they fell, flesh sizzling and armor scorched. The survivors huddled behind the neutron bomb's craterous wreckage, pinned and desperate. Private Rodriguez, barely old enough to be called a man, spotted a slim chance. He shouldered his anti-aircraft rifle, a relic from an older age repurposed for this grim future. Rodriguez broke cover, lining up a shot even as the gunship spun to vaporize him. The world narrowed to a single perfect moment. Rodriguez fired, the rifle bucking against him like a wild beast. The round streaked into the gunship's engines, detonating in a sunburst of roiling flames. The once proud vessel spiraled to the ground in a trail of fire and torn metal. But the young private paid a heavy price. Vulcan energy beams stitched a gruesome line across his chest, cooking flesh and shattering bone. He collapsed into a pool of his own blood, breath rattling in a ruined ribcage. Stevens and the survivors reached the neutron bomb at last, its menacing bulk looming over them. A quick inspection confirmed their worst fears. Without the tools or knowledge to disarm it, detonation was inevitable. Stevens made a split-second decision, born of desperation and the unbreakable spirit of humanity. "Tank convoy, this is Captain Stevens. Change of plans. Direct your drop pods to my location. I need you to bury this bomb." 10 seconds ticked by, each an eternity. Then a crackling response. "Affirmative, Captain. Drop pods inbound. Brace for impact." Stevens and his battered band of survivors hunkered down as fiery contrails split the sky. The drop pods screamed towards the planet, like the fists of an angry god, hurtling towards the neutron bomb. All they could do now was pray that this desperate ploy would work, that the tanks could bury the bomb deep enough to contain the blast. The alternative was too horrific to imagine. The pods slammed into the earth with thunderous impacts, throwing up geysers of dirt and rock. The ground heaved and shuddered, a planet quake that threatened to tear Arcturus asunder. Through the maelstrom of debris and fire, Stevens glimpsed the bomb vanishing into a deep crater, swallowed by the tortured earth. He clung to the fervent hope this would be enough. Overhead, Vulcan ships blotted out the sun, weapons charging for a final salvo. The battle still raged, the war far from over. But for this one crucial moment, humanity had denied the Vulcans their victory. Now they just had to survive the aftermath. The ground quaked as the tank drop pods slammed into the planet's surface, throwing up massive plumes of dirt and rock. Stevens and his team were hurled through the air by the shockwave, their bodies battered by the debris. As the dust began to settle, they pulled themselves from the rubble, coughing and bleeding but miraculously alive. The tanks, ancient relics from Earth's past, rolled forth from their craters, their armored hulls gleaming beneath layers of grime. They opened fire on the Vulcan forces, shells exploding in thunderous roars. The aliens, caught completely off guard by the sudden appearance of the archaic human vehicles, scrambled for cover as their front lines were torn apart. In his command ship high above, Thulis slammed his fist against the console, his eyes wide with disbelief as he watched his troops being pushed back by the relentless human assault. The tanks rolled onwards, their tracks crushing Vulcan bodies and equipment alike. Plasma fire dissipated harmlessly off their reinforced hulls, the technology gap between the two forces suddenly irrelevant. Thurl's shock quickly turned to rage, and he barked out a desperate command. "All ships, commence orbital bombardment. Target the humans and our own troops. I want that planet scoured clean." The Vulcan ships began to reorient, their weapons charging with an ominous hum. Stevens looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the telltale glow of the orbital cannons. He knew they had only moments to act. "All tanks, concentrate fire on those ships," Stevens shouted into his comm. "We need to disrupt their targeting systems before they can unleash hell on us." The tanks swiveled their turrets skyward, shells arcing up into the atmosphere. Explosions blossomed across the hulls of the Vulcan ships, the impacts sending them spinning off course. Some of the shots managed to penetrate, detonating within the vessels in blasts of fire and shrapnel. On the ground, Thompson and his strike team emerged from the tunnels behind the remaining Vulcan forces. They charged forward, rifles spitting plasma as they engaged the aliens in brutal close-quarters combat. The Vulcans, already in disarray from the tank assault, were unable to coordinate a defense. As the battle raged around him, Stevens' comm crackled to life. A garbled transmission from Earth filled his ears, the signal barely cutting through the interference. "Captain Stevens, Vulcan saboteur, infiltrated defense grid, shutting down orbital defenses, Earth vulnerable." Stevens' blood ran cold as the message cut out. He knew that if the saboteur succeeded, Earth would be left open to a full-scale Vulcan invasion. The battle for Arcturus IV was still far from over, but now the stakes had been raised even higher. They had to find a way to win here and now, not just for their own survival, but for the fate of their homeworld. Plasma fire stitched the ground around Stevens as he ducked behind the burned-out husk of a Vulcan artillery piece. His mind raced, desperately trying to formulate a plan. They were outgunned and outnumbered, but they had the tanks and the element of surprise. If they could just hold out a little longer. Stevens' mind raced as he crouched behind the smouldering tank wreckage. the weight of Earth's fate pressing down on him. He keyed his comm, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Corporal Kim, I have a critical mission for you." Kim's response crackled through the static. "Ready to serve, Captain." "I need you to assemble a team and commandeer one of the Vulcan dropships. We've received intel that a saboteur has infiltrated Earth's defense grid. You're the only ones I trust to stop them." "Consider it done, sir." Kim's resolve was unshakable, his loyalty to Earth unwavering. Stevens turned to his remaining troops, his eyes hard with determination. "The rest of you, we hold the line here. We give Kim the time he needs. For Earth." A resounding cry echoed across the battlefield as the humans steeled themselves for the fight of their lives. Kim and his hand-picked team fought their way through the embattled Vulcan ranks, their weapons spitting fire and fury. They moved as one, a well-oiled machine forged in the crucible of war. Vulcan soldiers fell before their onslaught, the dropship growing closer with each hard-won step. On the front lines, the ancient tanks roared their defiance. Shells hammered into the Vulcan formations, shattering their lines like glass. The aliens' energy weapons splashed harmlessly against the tanks' thick hides, a testament to the enduring might of human engineering. Thompson and his strike team emerged from the tunnels like vengeful spectres, catching the Vulcans in a withering crossfire. The aliens fell in droves, their bodies littering the rocky ground. The battle for Arcturus IV had reached a turning point, the human forces seizing the initiative against all odds. Kim's team finally reached the dropship, storming up the ramp with weapons blazing. The Vulcan crew fell before their fury, the ship secured in a matter of heartbeats. Kim slid into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying across the unfamiliar controls. The dropship lifted off, rocketing towards the stars and the beleaguered Earth. As they pierced the atmosphere, Kim couldn't shake the sense of dread that clawed at his gut. The saboteur was on Earth, the fate of billions hanging by a thread. Failure was not an option. The dropship screamed through the void, hurtling towards humanity's cradle. Kim's team checked their weapons, preparing for the fight to come. They knew the stakes, the weight of their duty pressing down on them like a physical force. They touched down on the outskirts of the defense grid facility, the dropship's ramp slamming into the Earth. Kim led the charge, his rifle held tight against his shoulder. They moved with silent precision, the facility's walls looming before them. The team infiltrated the complex, shadows clinging to them like a second skin. They wound through the corridors, ears straining for any sign of the saboteur. The fate of Earth hung in the balance, every heartbeat an eternity. A muffled clang echoed from the control room, the sound of a weapon being readied. Kim's team burst through the door, rifles sweeping the room. The Vulcan saboteur spun to face them, his face a mask of cruel determination. Kim's eyes locked onto the saboteur's console, lines of malicious code scrolling across the screen, a virus primed to cripple Earth's defenses. The saboteur's finger hovered over the execute key, a triumphant sneer splitting his alien features. Kim lunged forward, his rifle forgotten. He was a hacker first, a soldier second. His fingers danced across the keyboard, a desperate race against the saboteur's virus. The Vulcans snarled, lashing out with a vicious blow. Kim's team swarmed him, buying their corporal precious seconds. On Arcturus IV, Stevens's comm crackled to life. Thul's sneering visage filled the screen, the Vulcan commander's eyes glinting with malice. "Surrender now, human, and I may spare your pathetic Earth." Stevens's grip tightened on his rifle, his jawline hardening to steel. He met Thul's gaze, unflinching in the face of annihilation. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, the fate of humanity resting on his next words. Stevens' jaw clenched as Thul's ultimatum echoed in his ears. Surrender was not an option, not with Earth's fate hanging by a thread. His mind raced, desperate for a solution, a way to turn the tide against the overwhelming Vulcan forces. "Modify the tank cannons," Stevens barked into his comm. "Rig them to fire electromagnetic pulse rounds. We need to knock out those ship's systems and buy Kim more time." The tank crews leapt into action, tearing apart damaged Vulcan equipment to scavenge the necessary components. Sparks flew as they worked feverishly, retrofitting the ancient weapons with cutting-edge technology. Overhead, the orbital bombardment intensified, the ground quaking with each impact. Stevens watched as his men raced against time, their faces grim with determination. On Earth, Kim's fingers flew across the keyboard, lines of code scrolling past at breakneck speed. He had isolated the Vulcan virus, a malicious strand of data that threatened to bring humanity to its knees. Uploading the countermeasure, Kim's heart pounded in his chest. Every second counted, the fate of billions resting on his shoulders. Suddenly the control room's doors buckled, then burst inward. Vulcan soldiers poured through, weapons blazing. Kim's team reacted instantly, diving for cover and returning fire. Private Sarah Chen, a crackshot with nerves of steel, leapt to the front, her rifle spitting plasma. She dropped Vulcan after Vulcan, buying Kim precious seconds as he worked. A searing bolt caught Chen in the shoulder, spinning her to the ground. She gritted her teeth against the pain, forcing herself back to her feet. Her rifle barked again and again, holding the line against impossible odds. With a final keystroke, Kim slumped back in his chair, a triumphant grin on his face. The countermeasure was uploaded, the virus purged from Earth's defense grid. The orbital platforms thrummed to life, a shield against the looming Vulcan invasion fleet. On Arcturus IV, the modified tanks rolled out, their cannons thrumming with barely contained power. Stevens watched, his breath caught in his throat as they took aim at the Vulcan ships above. The cannons roared, electromagnetic pulses streaking into the sky like vengeful lightning. The Vulcan ships shuddered, their systems shorting out in a cascade of failures. Thrusters sputtered and died, weapons falling silent as the EMP took hold. Stevens wasted no time, seizing the moment of vulnerability. All forces advance, push them back. The human forces surged forward, the tanks at the vanguard. They crashed into the disoriented Vulcan lines like a tidal wave, cannons and machine guns roaring in a symphony of destruction. Vulcan soldiers scattered, their formation broken, their coordination shattered. The humans pressed the advantage, years of pent-up anger and loss fueling their attack. At the heart of the chaos, Stevens stood tall, his rifle barking as he led the charge. The Vulcans fell back, step by bloody step, their once certain victory slipping through their fingers. But the battle was far from over. Thule, his face contorted with rage, screamed orders from his command ship. He would not let the humans snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, not again. The Vulcan ships, their systems rebooting, began to reorient, weapons powering back up. The ground forces rallied, their discipline overcoming their shock. The two armies clashed anew, the fate of two worlds hanging in the balance. Arcturus IV trembled beneath the weight of their struggle, the very planet a battleground for the future of the galaxy. Stevens knew they were on a knife's edge, victory and defeat balanced on the razor-thin margin of their courage and sacrifice. Every human on Arcturus IV fought with the desperate strength of those who had nothing left to lose. In the skies above Earth, the defense platform stood firm, a bulwark against the Vulcan invasion fleet. But down in the blood-soaked mud of Arcturus IV, the war raged on, a brutal, unforgiving clash of wills. Stevens looked out over the battlefield, watching as his tanks smashed through Vulcan barricades, as his soldiers fought and died in the name of Earth. They had come so far, sacrificed so much. Thule's lips twisted in a cruel sneer, as he watched the human resistance crumble before his flagship's might. The dreadnought descended through the atmosphere of Arcturus IV, its hull glowing from the heat of re-entry. The Vulcan commander relished the opportunity to crush the humans personally, to grind their hopes into the blood-soaked dirt. On the surface, Stevens watched the massive ship descend, his jaw clenched tight. He knew the flagship posed a grave threat to their hard-won gains. The tanks, still retrofitted with EMP rounds, swiveled their turrets to face this new challenger. "All tanks, focus fire on the flagship's weak points," Stevens barked into the comm. "We've analyzed their defenses. Hit them hard and don't let up." The human tanks unleashed a coordinated barrage, EMP rounds and armor-piercing shells streaking towards the Vulcan dreadnought. Explosions blossomed across its shielding, the barrier flickering under the onslaught. Thorley snarled as his ship shuddered, the human's primitive weapons proving more effective than he anticipated. His clawed fingers dug into the armrests of his command chair, anger boiling in his veins. He would not be defeated by these lesser beings. "Charge the main cannon," Thule growled to his weapons officer. "Let's show these humans the true power of the Vulcan Empire." The flagship's main gun thrummed with building energy, a searing lance of destruction ready to be unleashed. Thule's eyes glinted with malice as he watched the targeting reticles settle on the human forces below. The cannon roared, a blinding beam of energy slamming into the planet's surface. Rock melted and tanks were vaporized instantly as the blast carved a molten path through the battlefield. Stevens watched in horror as several of his armored units vanished in the conflagration, the lives of his soldiers snuffed out in an instant. But the cannon's power came at a cost. Sensors across the battlefield lit up as the flagship's shield generators were pushed to their limit, the strain of firing the main gun leaving them vulnerable. Stevens seized the moment, a desperate plan forming in his mind. "Lieutenant Romanov," Stevens called over the comm, "take your tank platoon and flank the flagship. Hit those shield generators with everything you've got." "Understood, Captain," Romanov replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We'll make those Vulcan bastards pay." Romanov's tanks peeled away from the main battle, navigating the treacherous war-torn landscape. They wove between towering rock formations and plowed through fields of smoldering wreckage, the heat of the cannon's blast still shimmering in the air. The platoon reached their firing position, the flagship looming above them like a vengeful god. Romanov lined up his shot, the crosshairs settling on the pulsing generator housings. "All units fire on my mark," Romanov called out, his finger hovering over the trigger. 3, 2, 1, mark. The tanks fired as one, a volley of EMP and armor-piercing rounds slamming into the flagship's shield generators. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic, a shockwave of fire and debris washing over the battlefield. The dreadnought listed to one side, its shields flickering and dying under the assault. In his command chair, Thule roared with rage as warning lights flashed across his displays. He had underestimated these humans, a mistake he swore to never make again. But for now, he had to focus on the battle at hand, on crushing this resistance once and for all. The flagship's hull groaned as it righted itself, the massive vessel preparing to unleash its full might upon the humans below. Thule's eyes burned with hatred as he looked down upon the battlefield, upon the insignificant creatures who dared to defy him. He would make them suffer for this insolence. On the surface, Stevens watched as the flagship's shields blinked out, a grim smile spreading across his face. They had struck a blow against the Vulcan command ship, but the battle was far from over. The human forces rallied around their captain, ready to fight to their last breath for the survival of their species. The two armies clashed anew beneath the shadow of the wounded flagship, the fate of Earth and the galaxy hanging in the balance. The flagship shuddered violently as the EMP rounds and armor-piercing shells tore through its weakened shields. Explosions blossomed across its hull, the once mighty vessel now a wounded beast. Stevens wasted no time in pressing the advantage, his voice booming across the comm channels. "All units converge on the flagship, bring that behemoth down." Tanks roared across the battlefield, their treads churning up the blood-soaked earth. Infantry squads charged forward, their weapons spitting fire as they dodged the falling debris from the crippled dreadnought. Vulcan escape pods jettisoned from the ship, their occupants desperate to escape the impending destruction. On the bridge, Thule snarled as alarms blared and consoles sparked around him. His grand plans lay in ruins, his forces scattered and demoralized, but he refused to accept defeat, his pride demanding one final act of defiance. "Initiate the self-destruct sequence," he growled to his terrified crew. "If we cannot have this world, then no one will." As the battle raged outside, Sergeant Thompson and his breach team infiltrated the flagship's hull, cutting through the thick metal with plasma torches. They stormed the corridors, their weapons at the ready, prepared for the fierce resistance that awaited them. Vulcan crew members, desperation fueling their actions, threw themselves at the human intruders with reckless abandon. Plasma bolts and bullets tore through the confined spaces, the air thick with the stench of burnt flesh and ozone. Thompson and his team fought with grim determination, pushing their way towards the bridge 1 bloody meter at a time. The bridge doors loomed before them, a final barrier between them and their target. Thompson nodded to his squad, a silent signal to prepare for breaching. Explosives were set, the team stacking up on either side of the entrance. The charges detonated, blasting the doors inward in a shower of twisted metal. Thompson charged through the smoke, his rifle barking as he cut down the Vulcan guards. His team fanned out behind him, securing the perimeter and engaging the remaining bridge crew. In the center of the chaos stood Thule, his eyes burning with hatred as he faced his foes. "Surrender, Thule," Thompson demanded, his weapon trained on the Vulcan commander. "It's over." Thule's response was a guttural roar as he lunged at Thompson, his clawed hands seeking to rend and tear. The two warriors clashed in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, trading blows with savage ferocity. Around them, Thompson's team desperately worked to disable the self-destruct sequence, their efforts hindered by the Vulcan crew's fanatical resistance. Private O'Neill, his fingers flying across the unfamiliar controls, sweat beading his brow as he fought to override the countdown. Plasma bolts sizzled past his head, the young technician flinching, but never losing focus. With a final triumphant keystroke, the self-destruct sequence sputtered and died, the ship's systems locking down under O'Neill's digital assault. But victory came at a cost. A stray shot caught O'Neill in the chest, the private slumping over his console as his life bled out onto the deck. Thompson, locked in mortal combat with Thule, could only watch in horror as his comrade fell. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, Thompson overpowered Thule, slamming the Vulcan commander into the bulkhead. Thule, beaten but unbroken, spat a glob of blood at Thompson's feet. "You may have won this battle, human," he sneered, "but the war is far from over." Thule's hand darted to his wrist, activating a hidden failsafe. The bridge shook violently, emergency klaxons blaring as the command module detached from the rest of the ship. Thompson and his team could only watch as Thule's pod blasted free, escaping into the void of space. The humans scrambled to obey, fighting their way back to their dropships as the dreadnought crumbled around them. Tanks and infantry units disengaged from the doomed vessel, racing to clear the blast radius. The Vulcan flagship, once a symbol of the Empire's might, exploded in a searing flash of light, the shockwave rippling across the battlefield like a vengeful god's wrath. As the dust settled and the echoes of the blast faded, Stevens surveyed the carnage with a grim sense of satisfaction. They had struck a decisive blow against the Vulcans, but the cost had been high. The bodies of the fallen, human and Vulcan alike, littered the scarred landscape, a testament to the brutality of the conflict. As the echoes of the flagship's cataclysmic destruction faded, an eerie silence settled over the war-torn landscape of Arcturus IV. The remaining Vulcan forces, their resolve shattered by the loss of their commander and the might of the human resistance, laid down their weapons in surrender. Stevens and his battle-weary troops accepted their capitulation, securing the prisoners and beginning the grim task of assessing the aftermath. Medics rushed to tend to the wounded, triaging the most critical cases and providing what comfort they could to the dying. Engineers and technicians picked through the smoldering wreckage of tanks and ships, salvaging what they could and marking the locations of the fallen for later retrieval. The once pristine valley now bore the scars of war, the ground littered with twisted metal and the broken bodies of both human and Vulcan soldiers. As Stevens surveyed the carnage, a heavy weight settled in his chest. Each casualty was a life cut short, a family left grieving, a future snuffed out. The cost of victory had been high, and he knew that the scars left by this battle would linger long after the physical wounds had healed. A shout from the perimeter drew Stevens' attention, and he saw Thompson waving him over to a battered Vulcan dropship that had crashed nearby. As he approached, he could see the ship's hatch had been pried open, revealing a grim sight within. Thule lay in a crumpled heap, his once proud form broken and bleeding. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle against the encroaching spectre of death. Stevens and Thompson climbed into the dropship, the confined space thick with the coppery scent of blood and the acrid stench of burnt circuitry. As they knelt beside the dying Vulcan, Thule's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused. "You think you've won," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the wheezing of his punctured lungs. "But this is only the beginning." With trembling hands, Thule reached into his shattered armor, his fingers closing around a small data device. He pressed it into Stevens' palm, his grip surprisingly strong for a man on the brink of death. "The Vulcan Armada," Thule whispered, his words laced with a mixture of pride and desperation. "They're coming. An invasion force unlike any you've ever seen. They'll burn your world to ashes and scatter your people to the winds." Stevens' heart raced as he processed Thule's revelation. The battle for Arcturus IV had been a mere prelude, a distraction from the true threat that loomed on the horizon. He glanced down at the data device, knowing that the information it contained could be the key to humanity's survival. "Why tell us this?" Stevens asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Why give us this information?" A wry smile tugged at the corners of Thule's mouth, a trickle of blood seeping from between his lips. "Because I want you to know the true face of your enemy," he said, his voice growing fainter with each word. "I want you to see the futility of your resistance. When the Armada arrives, you'll beg for the mercy of a quick death." With a final shuddering breath, Thule's eyes glazed over, his body going limp. Stevens and Thompson shared a grim look, the weight of the Vulcan's warning hanging heavy in the air. As they emerged from the dropship, Stevens clutched the data device tightly, his mind racing with the implications of Thule's revelation. He knew that he had to act quickly, to warn Earth of the impending invasion, and mobilize every resource at their disposal. Striding through the battlefield, Stevens activated his long-range communicator, hailing the command center back on Earth. "This is Captain Stevens," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency of his message. "We've secured Arcturus IV, but we have intel on an imminent Vulcan invasion of Earth. I'm transmitting the data now. We need to mobilize every ship, every soldier, every weapon we have. This is it, the fight for our very survival." As the transmission ended, Stevens turned to face his troops, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "We fought hard today," he said, his voice carrying over the assembled soldiers. "We bled. We lost good people. But this is just the beginning. The real battle is still to come, and we'll need every one of you to defend our home." The soldiers nodded grimly, their faces set with the same resolve that burned in Stevens's heart. They had come too far, lost too much, to let the Vulcans win now. As the human forces began to regroup and prepare for the long journey back to Earth, Stevens took a moment to reflect on the sacrifices that had brought them to this point. He thought of Rodriguez, who had given his life to destroy the gunship, of O'Neill, who had hacked the flagship systems at the cost of his own, of Chen, who had held the line against impossible odds. Their deaths would not be in vain. Stevens silently vowed to honor their memory, to fight with every ounce of strength and courage he possessed. He would make the Vulcans pay for every drop of human blood they had spilled, for every world they had burned. Looking up at the stars, Stevens could almost hear the distant thunder of Vulcan war drums, an ominous portent of the battles to come. But he stood tall, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For Earth, for humanity, he would fight to his last breath. The scene faded to black, the weight of the coming war hanging heavy in the air. The fate of the galaxy would be decided in the fires of battle, and Stevens knew that he and his fellow humans would be... You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.